cin.get and while loops. So what does cin.get do? Cin.get is used to read a string of characters or just one character. Okay, so you have seen input in variables, assignments, and expressions. You've seen how to read input from the user, more in data types and math functions, input stream, and cin functions. Remember, you've seen how to read input from the user. Now we're going to do a little bit more. And in fact, in here, you did see how to do cin.peek and cin.get and cin.getLine, some of those things. You've already seen that. Now we're going to see a little bit more about cin.get and while loops combined. What can you do with them? How can you read characters? So if you look in here, and so right there it says you've talked about that, cin.get to read a string of characters, not into an array, but read continuously a bunch of characters like a string from the user and do something with it. So this program will read characters until end of file. End of file is signified by Control D in a lot of consoles. Control D signifies end of file. So it's not new line, it's Control D. So as long as you don't hit Control D, it will keep reading input. Okay, and we're going to read it one character at a time. So it says it reads a string of characters, counts the number of characters, and it also counts the number of letters. That's what this program does, just for fun. So I have a couple of variables, count and count A. Count just counts the number of letters. Each letter is a byte. Remember, each character is a byte. Count A is just the number of A's. And then I have a variable called letter where I store the letter. So I told you to just keep entering text, and you should really say till end of file, Control D to end. So if you put that in there, Control D to end, so they know that when they press Control D, we are done reading. cin.peek. Cin.peek says just peek in the buffer, and if it is Control D, then don't do anything, come out of the while loop. As long as it is not Control D, and cin.peek is very important. In order to read Control D, that character, you don't want to be using cin.get, you need to use cin.peek so you can actually peek at the character and see if it is the end of file. If it's not end of file, then we go in, we increment a count to say, okay, that's one letter. We read it, cin.get into letter, whatever the character is, we read it into the variable letter. We check if it is A, I increment the A count, and then I keep going in the while loop. So as long as you keep entering text, notice this is all the text that we've entered. And at the end of this line, I've done Control D, and so it stops. And it says you have this many characters and you have this many A's is what it should say. Okay, so character count is 53 characters, A count is, I have 10 A's. Okay, so now running the same code in Replit, here's the same code, it's a little different. I'm not reading anything into a char variable, I'm just getting the character and throwing it off. That's what that does. cin.get with no variable inside will just discard it. Okay, so every letter just gets read and discarded, and all I'm doing is keeping count. So I run the program, it says enter text, Control D to end. I can type in, hit enter, more stuff. Now I am going to do Control D at the beginning of next line. Enter, then do Control D, and it says you entered 83 bytes or 83 characters, really. One byte is a character is 1 byte, right? So now you can use this in combination with a lot of other things that you have learned. For example, if you go back here to your conditionals where you saw character operations, 5.6, you know how to check to see if each one is an alphabet or a digit or a space. So for example, you could come to this code, and if you wanted to count the number of words, how would you do it? Every time you encounter a space, it's a word, right? So you could have a variable called a char, something, call it letter, even though it's not, it could be something that's not a letter. So read it into that cin.get, and then you check. After you count, you check if is space of letter. If this is true, then maybe you want to increment a variable called word, which I will initialize as an int and set to 0. So every time you encounter a space, you increment word, and that would be your word count. If I output it, actually, which I'm not doing here, how about we change that? Okay, so let me stop and rerun it again. So I changed the output to say you entered word words, that many words. Okay, so if I say this is a test, more stuff, Control D, it says you entered 6 words. Every time I hit a space, it counts a word. So whatever you want to do, right? You can read and do without having to store all the characters. You can get a lot of statistics on the string that you read from the user. You're not storing the string, but you can count the lines, you can count the words, you can count other things in it. You can find, word count, letter count, lots of different things. But that's how you use cin.get and while loops combined together. And we'll see more about cin.get when you get to 161b char arrays.